Right, okay, well, I might just start with the intro because it's a couple of minutes past. So welcome everybody. Thanks ever so much for joining us at what I can only assume is probably a very busy day at school. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to our webinar, You Can't Revise for A-Level English with Mark Roberts. I'm Katie Sargent and I'm the Secondary Publishing Director at Collins. And it's been absolutely brilliant working with Mark and the team here on his new book. And I'm really excited for him to share his insights into how to revise effectively with lots of practical examples. I hope it will be a really useful session for you when thinking about sort of the next term ahead and your new A-level students, particularly those who'll be facing their first formal exams next summer. And I'm sure that you'll come away sort of fizzing with ideas and lots of strategies to put into place straight away. So Mark's presentation will be about 30 minutes and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. If you do think of anything as we go along, please do pop them in the Q&A box or the comments at any point and we'll make sure that we address them. And just a quick note again that the webinar is being recorded and we'll share that afterwards. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Mark to introduce himself and to start the session. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to have so many of you here today to talk about this very exciting book for me. And hopefully you'll find it particularly useful and it'll be something that will give you a few key ideas that you can share with students. So if any students are listening, obviously things that are going to help you significantly with your exams. I started out as an English teacher going back well over a decade now in a school in inner city Manchester that was a boys only comprehensive school. Started out as an English teacher and I worked my way up to becoming a head of English. And then I moved to a school in Devon that was a mixed comprehensive school with a sixth form in Devon. And as head of English there, really enjoyed starting to teach English literature at A-level. And I've worked my way up to being an assistant principal, and then in my new school, where I work at Carrickfergus Grammar School in Northern Ireland, I now work as a director of research, as well as being an English teacher, and it's really exciting that I can still spend so much of my time in the classroom. I get to spend a good 3 days a week teaching English, and it's an absolute joy to be able to teach students of all ages, and hopefully these kind of strategies that I've used successfully over the years will be things that will be helpful for you. And I was really inspired, I think, to write this book by this kind of common misconception that students seem to have, that English is somehow different, that it's a subject that somehow means that you can't revise for it in a similar way that you could do with your maths or biology textbooks or whatever it may be. So the idea of, that yes, you can is something that hopefully we'll be able to come across throughout this the course of this webinar, both at GCSE and specifically for today, looking at A-level English literature. So the book itself is published very shortly, on the 24th of June. It's still available for pre-order. And one thing just to point out at this stage, that if you go on to popular websites, if you go onto the Collins websites or if you go into Amazon websites, for individual copies, there'll be a certain cost. But if you wanted to buy in a bulk cost as a school for a particular cohort, it's obviously reduced. So please do get in touch with the Collins website to look at that, taking advantage of that particular price. In terms of my background, as well as a teacher, I spent a lot of the last few years writing. So back in 2019, my book, Boys Don't Try, co-written with Matt Pinkett, came out. I write frequently for Tests magazine on all kinds of issues, including English subject knowledge. I've written for Emag quite recently, quite a few articles looking at English literature and even some language pieces. And I've written the introduction to the Collins classic classroom editions to Frankenstein and Romeo and Juliet as well. And then going back to last year, going back to 2020, the GCSE version of this book came out. And that was such a success that we were inspired to carry on and do it at an A-level basis. I've also got another book out at the moment. I've been very busy recently. which is called The Boy Question, and that's all aimed at teachers of boys in the classroom, and that's published very soon as well. So it's very busy. But today we're going to focus on this book. We're going to focus on Yes You Can. And as well as the book, we've also been doing a bit of podcasting recently. There's 3 episodes of the podcast if you're interested in this. And what we do is we take a particular popular exam text, and we look at one extract in a lot of detail with myself, the host James Trapp, and individual expert guests for each text. So far, we've looked at GCSE texts. So we've looked at Macbeth, Jekyll and Hyde, and an Inspector Calls is the next one that's coming out. We also looked at A Christmas Carol. And the idea is that over time, we'll start to do A-level versions of this as well. So if you want to follow at Can't Revise Eng, we will start to look at some of the more popular A-level literature texts and start to scrutinise those in particular detail as well, if you're interested in listening to podcasts. If we look at the book, we've really adapted the successful ideas from the GCSE version, but added in new things that are specifically relevant to A-level literature. And particularly interesting, I think, for students are the ideas of applying critical viewpoints and developing academic writing styles. And I think there's 2 areas that students traditionally find quite difficult, and often there'll be things that as an A-level teacher, you can tell whether it's going to be something that might influence their overall grade quite quickly if students have got the ability to keep on working at developing their academic writing, but also thinking very carefully about how they're going to apply critical viewpoints, because that's something that's going to be essential to success at A-level. But as well, we're going to look at some of the other key areas that you might recognise from GCSE study, but they're obviously going to be done at a more advanced level. But the aim of the book is to take academic excellence and take the real expertise of the book, but make it accessible, make it something that students can pick up and really embrace the ideas quite quickly. So what can teachers do to help their students revise for this particular subject? Today, I'm going to look at 5 particular steps that I think are really important for A-level lit success. So we're going to talk about the idea of revision. We're going to look at some of the most important learning strategies and study strategies. I'm going to think about how you as a teacher can ensure that you're using modelling most effectively. The idea about pre-preparing work ahead of exams and thinking about what you're going to write before you go into the actual exam itself. And then this key thing that I've mentioned about continually striving to improve this quality of our academic writing. So let's take a look at this first idea about the concept of revision itself. Now, down the left-hand side, that column stuff in red, I think these are kind of traditional attitudes towards revision. Both, if we dare say it, both from students and teachers. So it's this idea that teachers often say things like when you start revision nearer to your exams, or when you start going through your notes again, things like that. And it's this idea that towards the end of each course, or as you move towards a mock exam or some other significant assessment point, it's this idea that then you'll begin your revision. And revision is often thought of as something that's done at home or in after-school sessions if the teacher's putting on sessions for students. And it's this idea of going over stuff, usually going over stuff that you've been doing recently. But I think it's really important that the language that we use is we make it clear as teachers that revision is this ongoing little and often process. And it's something that if students start to do it from the moment they begin their begin their A-level course at the start of year 12, that they will be able to avoid these kind of last minute sessions that involve cramming things in. And that space practice will be essential to this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And that this preparation that's done in lesson is the first stepping point towards revision at home and effective study at home, so that we're not thinking of this big separation between the two, and we're really thinking about how revision is something that's integral to what's going on in our lessons. And that rather than thinking about going over stuff recently, we're taking things that we're learning at the moment and then applying them to new topics and to things that we've done, and try to make those kind of links between the subjects, between the strands of the subject is absolutely vital. So what's this going to look like in practice? Well, first of all, even students who've been really successful at GCSE English still tend to take pretty rubbish notes in my experience. And there's a problem with this because note taking is quite tricky to do unless someone shows you. So students will fall into the trap of trying to copy everything down that you say or everything that you've put up on the board. And often the teacher will speak much quicker than the student can write, and they just end up, losing trains of thought or starting to write something down and abandoning it mid-sentence and so on. So it's really important that we show them how to use effective note-taking strategies such as Cornell notes. And I know with one of my year 12s who got a grade 9 in English literature, when I sat down and methodically showed her how to go and through each step of the process, it was just kind of mind blown that no one had ever shown this practice before, and she just kind of got through by just kind of writing rubbish notes and doing well despite those notes. So this step-by-step guide is really important, and there's a chapter in the book that models this process. So they think very carefully about how they're going to lay things out on the page. And then crucially, they're going to come up with a set of questions that's going to go in the left-hand column. And then the notes on the right-hand side will be bullet points related to answering that question. And it's really important that wherever possible, these notes answer a particular question. I'll explain why shortly. And at the bottom, you're going to have a short summary, preferably in a different colour, where you're just going to have a few bullet points that will summarise what's been covered so far on that page, so that when students are flicking through to try to find relevant resources to revise from, they've got a quick guide at the bottom in their summary. And this is an example of what it might look like from the text Beloved. So there's questions down the left-hand side, and then there are answers down the right-hand side. Now, the benefit of doing this question and answer approach is that we'll often talk to students about using flashcards. They can use their Cornell notes as a form of revision. All they need to do is just get a blank piece of paper and cover up their notes on the right-hand side. And then on the left-hand side, they've got questions, and they just have to see if they can answer the questions. And it's a really effective, quick way of doing retrieval practice. And once students get into the habit of that, that's great. But a more advanced way is to think not just about taking notes for Cornell notes based on things that you might have watched, like documentaries or your little mini lectures within class, but also whenever they get given a handout, this can be something that can be directly placed onto Cornell notes. Rather than what tends to happen is students will get something like this and they'll often underline it or they'll highlight it, and usually it ends up absolutely covered with neon green, so that 2/3 of the page is highlighted or 2/3 of the page is underlined, and you tend not to see anywhere near as many notations as you do things being highlighted or underlined. And when students come back to look at them, they're absolutely useless to these notes because they just see green stuff on a page or lines on a page rather than actual useful notes. And again, I would go under the visualizer and model what it looks like when you take rubbish notes and come back to it a couple of days later and say, can anybody tell me what my notes mean? And it's amazing how these things are just taken for granted. We know as expert teachers who've really succeeded in the subject, often we've learned the hard way that we eventually over time work out a decent way of taking notes. If we can get someone to show us and cut the corner of having to wait for a few years before you realise what makes good notes, well then that's going to help our students massively. So this kind of handout can be turned again into a Cornell notes sheet where we get directly a couple of key questions from the particular text, and then a couple of answers, and then a quick summary of it at the bottom. And I've used this not just with A-level students, but I've been teaching this to year 7s, year 8s, year 9s recently. And it's just amazing the difference it makes when they've got decent notes to go back and look at. In terms of these study techniques, well, we know from the findings of cognitive science that using highlighting, using rereading, doing things like cramming in a single session, say 4 hours before exam, we know that these are not useful techniques. So we need to make sure that our students are using retrieval and spaced practice. And I think that I've been guilty of this in the past, and I think that lots of English teachers are, where at GCSE, there's this emphasis on, you've got to learn quotes, you've got to remember them for closed book exams. And because it tends to be open book exams once you get to A level, some people kind of take the foot off the gas and think, well, we don't need to do that as much anymore. But I think actually we're letting students down if we're not constantly using retrieval and spaced practice, not just for memorizing quotes, although that does save time massively in exams rather than flicking through the book, but also just to ensure that we are testing them on any kind of knowledge that we've learned previously. And as I'll show you in a bit, retrieval practice doesn't just need to be simple recalling of facts or single words or things like that. So we need to make sure that they're using retrieval and spaced practice. But there's a problem. Even when students are made aware about the benefits of retrieval practice, they often end up going back to these techniques that are nowhere near as useful. So if you do a study skills session on the first day as part of their A-level induction or something like that, there's chances are that they'll probably start to slip back into the bad habits unless you keep on going back over these kind of things. And particularly, I think this is something where students get into the habit of leaving things a little bit late, because what the research shows is that they'll often start with these good techniques, but then they'll abandon them because they leave it too late in the day, and they feel as if the other ways of studying, rereading, highlighting, are much more easy, and they do give this illusion of fluency. But actually it's the tricky ones, the difficult ways of revising, using spaced and retrieval practice, that's particularly important. So we need to make sure that we're using this in our lessons and that we're setting it as part of homework. So what does this look like? Well, we all know about quizzes, multiple choice questions, and so on. But there's other ways of mixing it up that I think are particularly useful at A-level. So some of my favourites, we know when we want them to be good writers, we want them to be able to choose words effectively. Just little things like this, commonly confused words, and they've got to tell me what the difference is between these, what do these mean? And they're words that even skilled writers get mixed up. So these little things are good starting points of discussion. Also things like odd one out, where you give them a list of 3 things and you have to say what's the odd one out and why. Can often bring about really interesting philosophical discussions based on this. Some might just be a very straightforward, factual reason why it's the odd one out. Others you could argue for quite a while, and I've had some of these ones that have gone on for like 10-minute debates based on certain interpretations of keywords. And I like to mix it up so that you're looking at some real close language analysis stuff as well, like word class things, like the bottom one looks at modality and things like that. So those kind of things can be really interesting. I use a lot of starter for 5, where you have to list 5 things, 4 things, 3 things, and so on all the way down. Some of these will be nice and easy and very accessible. Others will be much more challenging. And they're just kind of things that we work on throughout the course. So it's really important that when you're using these starter for 5s that you are mixing it up. It's not just about the text that you're doing at the moment. When you get into year 13, it's about texts that you've been doing back at the start of year 12 as well, and things that you've not covered for 6 months or so on, just to make sure that it becomes embedded over time. But as well, you've got the more complex ideas there. So statements that are really there to think about in a very deep way. Often they're kind of like little mini essay questions sometimes, but often they're even more challenging than essay questions. And these are kind of big ideas that really get them thinking. And again, really stimulating debate, and you get them to either come up with mini paragraphs or bullet points on it. Might be a springboard for what happens next in the lesson. But don't fall into the trap of assuming that retrieval is just about filling in gaps or things like this. These kind of things really do, as I say, stimulate thought and debate. A favourite of mine, anyone who's seen my GCSE guide will know that I'm a big fan of single word quotes. And often students fall into the trap of trying to memorise chunks of text that's too big. Now, when it comes to A-level literature, a key thing that they do need to be able to memorise usually is critical quotes. So I'll give them single words that are taken from some of the critic quotes that we've discussed and looked at in detail, and they've got to use this single word as a way of remembering the whole of the quotation. I'll try to pick ones that are quite short anyway. So when you look at these are all related to critics writing about Othello, and those are the answers. I'll just let you look at those for a moment. So hopefully what you can see there is that keywords like irresistible, Europeanize, are themselves prompts for them to think about the rest of the quotation, but are also prompts for them to think about which words can they just get away with knowing from certain critics without having to know big whole chunks. And it might be that Europeanize in itself is one word that will, you know, do as a critic and will really help to get into the mindset of a fellow. Okay, so the next thing that we need to think about, and I've always talked about this a little bit with note taking, is modeling each stage of the process. So when we talk to them about the kinds of things we want them to do in revision, like flashcards and using them and picking quotes out, really making it integral to the lesson, we say, this is how I do it. This is where I would start. This is how I would organize my flashcards. You may assume that students who've got to this level know how to do this, but invariably I find that they don't, and that when someone points out what you think are really obvious things, they're really grateful about this. Identifying killer quotes is really important, and we're going to look at that in a moment. But particularly these key things about essay writing skills, we know how important it is for A-level literature that they can bring in critical theory and can bring in context, and how they can weave that in without overdoing it. And you have to constantly be modeling that and showing that, and thinking aloud and justifying and questioning and editing and changing your mind and explaining to them why you've changed your mind about things and stuff like that. So this idea about editing, redrafting, working on stuff is something that I think is absolutely vital. I'm not a fan of going into a lesson with a pre-made essay answer that you give to them. I want them to see me struggle and work things out and discuss and as an expert try to, you know, justify what I'm doing and why. Okay, so in terms of killer quotes, there's a whole list of these in one of the chapters in the book, and we look at certain words that I think certain quotations really act as like a Swiss Army knife. That they're really versatile. They're really useful for answering nearly all the questions in some cases. And if you can try to like narrow down a text to say 5 key quotes that would answer most essay questions, these are really interesting discussions in themselves. What makes it a key quote, what doesn't make it a key quote, and things like that. And which ones are the most useful, which ones have the most utility. Some people don't like this. Some purists say, actually, you know, you shouldn't be narrowing text down to certain key quotations. But I think you're doing students a disservice if you've not primed them to think about which ones are going to be most useful for exams. Of course, you want students to go off and pick their own quotes and have their own opinions about things. But I think you've got to give them that basic foundation in ones that are particularly useful. The next thing is thinking about some of the common errors that happen when you're looking at context. This is a list that I put together, and there's a full chapter on this that thinks about the kind of common errors that I see, as well as the ones that keep on cropping up in examiners' reports across all of the exam board specs. And one that is particularly important that might not come out as much at GCSE is focusing on writers' biographical details and thinking very carefully as a teacher. If you're showing them a documentary about the private life of Lord Byron, is that useful to his poetry? In some cases, it may well be. In other cases, it might just be a little bit of salacious gossip that's not particularly going to help them really get to understand the themes and language of the poem. So little things like that to consider as well, and to really think about, and making sure that they are really thinking carefully about which context is the most useful and why. Same goes for bringing in critical theory and thinking really carefully about analytical and evaluative verbs. And again, there's lists of both of those. I think evaluative verbs in particular are absolutely essential to successful writing within A-level literature. And as well as that, bringing in these little sentence stems that can bring in critics and little debates about, is it better to start your paragraph with a critical quote that introduces it, or do you want to tag it in the end, and things like that. And again, this is things that need to be modelled throughout, but there's some examples in the book that I think give you a bit of a starting point to get stuck into. This other one is something that I think is essential as well, that I think students who go into exams thinking, well, I'll see what the question is, and make up my answer on the day, generally don't do as well as ones who've really thought long and hard about what's going to be in, to the extent that they've written out banks of essays and that they've got certain essays that they're going to use and tweak depending on what question comes up. Again, the exam board tell you not to do this. The exam board say that they see examples of students who don't answer the question because they've got pre-prepared essays. And I'm sure that's true, and some students don't tweak them effectively enough and they don't adapt enough. But actually, I think what they don't recognise is that loads of students do this, and because they do it so well, the examiners don't notice it. And every student I've taught, pretty much who's gone on and absolutely smashed A-level literature and got incredibly high scores, they are the ones who do the most pre-preparation. They absolutely do, and they've got maybe have 2 or 3 essays metaphorically up their sleeve. No actual taking them up the sleeve, that wouldn't be good, but metaphorically up the sleeve, and they are very much ready to adapt it on the day. So I think that pre-preparing structures and paragraphs is absolutely key. But I would say is I don't think you should start essay writing too soon in year 12. I often see teachers where you'll teach the new play, say you're doing Shakespeare or something, or the new novel. You spend a few weeks on it and then you'll hit them with a practice essay, and often they're just not prepared to succeed at that stage. They're not fully prepared, and I would say that essay writing is something that should be really built up and gradually worked on, because I think it can be really damaging to confidence if you attempt to do it too soon, too soon. So that's something that I would think really carefully about as a department and as an individual teacher. When are we going to start getting them to write essays? What's our rationale behind their essay writing progress, and thinking really carefully about it. One thing that is an example of the kind of things that I get them to pre-prepare are introductions for poems. And for the anthology, just a little mini intro for the key poems that you're going to be studying, but also unseen poetry for the relevant specs is an area that I think students really struggle to get going. And I think that if you work on this particular technique for a little brief thesis statement for the poems that you study, or for preparing to do unseen poems, is a really nice little way of doing it. And I follow the form, tone, conceit, deeper meaning pattern. You can change the order if you want to do form, conceit, tone, deeper meaning. But I think if you look at those things, it tends to cover some of the kind of main things that you want to introduce as a bit of an overview of the poem. And I've practiced this with my students over the last few years, and they found this a really useful structure to use going into unseen poetry. We were doing EdXL, where you were looking at one unseen poem compared to one seen poem, and it works really well to follow this balance. This is an example from a couple of unseen poems that sometimes crop up on the GCSE spec, but hopefully you'll see there that it's got the bits underlined is the form, the tone that's adopted, what the conceit, what the kind of clever idea or the extended metaphor of the poem is, and then a couple of deeper meanings, so that they're really getting into summarising the deeper meaning of the poem quite quickly. I'll just be quiet for a moment and just let you look at that. Now, the other thing about this one is it's practicing starting to embed little single word quotations or little mini quotes as well. So that's something else that's a little skill to work on. That's another example that looks at comparing a seen poem with an unseen poem. And similar again, it's got form, tone, conceit, and then a couple of deeper meanings there as well. As well as looking at introductions, there's also a section in the book that looks at conclusions. And again, conclusions often tend to be pretty poor, and I don't think we practice this enough. And just having a nice, simple way of concluding an essay is particularly useful. And this is a nice little two-step way to try and say something clever at the end, having already gone through your main ideas. So that's just another little example there of how to structure that. And this takes us just onto our final thing of looking at academic writing. So as well as the overall structure of looking at those kind of things, introductions, thesis statements, main body, conclusion, I think also we're going to look at some of the common things that students do wrong when they're writing academically, as well as some of the things that really successful students do. So the first thing is getting students away from writing about characters as constructs, from writing about them as people and getting them to write about characters as constructs. So taking ones where they make them seem like real people and adapting them so we're seeing them thinking about authorial intent. I think authorial intent is probably one of the key threshold concepts within A-level literature, thinking about what the writer is trying to achieve, in our opinion, is something that's absolutely vital. And you get those evaluative verbs through that, you get the critical ideas through that, but also you get them as constructs that have been crafted and made to say something about society. Thinking very carefully about making use of nominalization, so making sure that we're turning verbs and adjectives into nouns and practicing that at times and just showing how to do it well and how to make sure we don't overdo it. And then also, finally, looking at using these particularly sophisticated little patterns, which we call positives or positive nouns, where we take a particular noun or noun phrase and we give more information about it. We add another noun or noun phrase to it just to give us a more sophisticated way of trying to introduce topics. And again, modelling this throughout is absolutely key. And it's something that I think students can do really successfully if they have a lot of experience of doing this within class. Okay, so yeah, final reminder about the book. And I mean, really hope you do find it useful if you get your hands on a copy. I'm sure you will. And now I'd really like to take any questions that you've got. It can be about anything I've discussed or anything else that I'll have a stab at answering about A-level English literature teaching or revision. So yeah, if you wanted to stick any questions you've got in the Q&A box, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Just one moment, I'm just trying to find my chat box. I just need to stop sharing my screen. Okay. Right. Okay, so I'll just give you a moment just to stick any questions in if you've got any. Okay, so first question, have you had any success with sharing some of these strategies across other subjects at A-level too? I've not taught any other subjects at A-level, so personally no, but I think that there's a big opportunity for departments to work together, particularly when you look at things like humanities, social studies. So I did do some work in my last school, working with teachers of philosophy and ethics and RS at A-level, and training them to train their students to work on these particular topics. And so looking at things like positives and nominalization, and that was particularly useful to them. So I've not taught them myself, but I've taught other teachers to use them. Next question, could you explain again how you use nominal? So in terms of nominalization, if we think about certain words that are verbs, so if we might say something like, Iago describes a fellow as, and then it's a particular quotation. That's fine and it's accurate, but if you change that word describe into description, Iago's description of a fellow as, it sounds a bit more formally academic. So just working on those little things, just looking at sentences and thinking, am I using adjectives or am I using verbs in a way where I could use a noun instead? And just looking at it and showing to your students the difference it makes when you use that kind of language. So it might say something like the difference between saying your writing is very sophisticated, that's an adjective, your writing shows great sophistication is a noun. It sounds better, the last one sounds better. So that's just something in terms of nominalization, and that's how I would work on that, and just repeatedly in retrieval practice, give them these little starters where I'll say, take this paragraph and I want you to nominalize it. So take a paragraph. So I know at GCSE I did one where I put something like Benvolio is the peacemaker of the play. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Benvolio tries to bring peace during the play, and we nominalized it as Benvolio is the play's peacemaker. Just again, sounds more sophisticated, sounds better. Next question. Hi, do you incorporate literary criticism as you read a text, or do you wait until the end? I tend to bring it in as we go. I can see the benefits and the disadvantages of doing cold reads where you just go all the way through reading a play or watching the film version of it or something like that, or a novel or something, but I like to bring it in as we go. And I think that it can really enliven a pupil's understanding of it straight away. Say, for example, with Othello, if you go back to this idea that Coleridge says that Iago has got this motiveless malignity. In other words, there's no reason for the kind of evil that he brings into the world. He's just one of these people who wants to watch the world burn, that kind of thing. I think if you mention that at the start, then you can start to look at examples as you go through the play and say, does this look motiveless? What do we think of this list of reasons that he gives here? Is he giving a motive or not? So for me, I like to go through it as we go. Okay. How do you stop students taking subtle things you said about text and then wildly misquoting them as gospel, other than obviously challenging misconceptions? Yeah, what I would do is I would take some of those examples. I wouldn't identify students while I was doing it, but I'd take the kind of thing that they say, rewrite it a little bit so that it's as if it's me or like an imaginary student writing it, and I'd share them with the rest of the class, and I'd get those students and other students to work on why this is problematic, what's up with this, why doesn't this sound particularly sophisticated, what's this not quite understanding. So I think that the kind of common misconceptions ones, as you said, you can challenge it, but you can show them what these misconceptions look like in a step-by-step essay writing process. Another example that comes to mind from A-level is the misuse of the word catharsis, and often the misuse of the ideas about hamartia as well. So I'll kind of bring in examples of that. So I'll do a little paragraph where students have kind of misunderstood the ideas behind some of these Greek tragic terms and shown what can go wrong when you go down that route. So I think live modelling and discussing them as you go is the best way to address those kind of things. Will the book be available on Kindle? That's a question for Katie. If you're able to type in for that, please, Katie. I'm not sure if it is Kindle available at the moment, but if you could let me know. Oh, we're getting an answer now. That's great.
Yeah, I think Nina's typing. Yes, it is available on Kindle. Yep, at the same time as the paperback.
Wonderful. That's brilliant. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Okay. Often students' explanation of context is limited to patriarchy, feminist and ill-perceived timelines. How do we really make context valuable? That's a great question, and it's something that I've been really toying with recently. There was a brilliant paper that was written by, I think it's Victoria Elliott from Oxford University, and this was with open access. And it talks about the problem of kind of retrofitting modern ideas to texts that weren't written at a time when considerations of feminism and so on were prevalent at the time. And that's a really good place to start, I would say. So I'd introduce this with students and say, what are some of the issues with us as modern readers making judgment about ideas from, I don't know, 1595 or even 1930, and thinking very much in those terms. I think that context becomes most valuable when it's doing something that is enhancing our understanding of the text, rather than just commenting about the treatment of a particular character. So I think that, to me, I look for it and think, is it really enhancing our understanding of characterization or particular ideas about society that, if we don't grasp these, we won't really grasp the text itself. If not, well then, it's there to be evaluated, it's there to be challenged. And I think this is the other thing about context and critical ideas, is that really successful students will challenge things. I know when we were studying Beloved, for example, the misconceptions about the end of slavery with Abraham Lincoln, apparently all slaves were freed and everything was fine, and that kind of thing. And going back and looking at history alongside the literary criticism as well, and really thinking carefully about whether these so-called historical events were actually quite as straightforward as they were. There's a really good episode on a BBC documentary called something like the American history's biggest fibs, for example, that tackles that and challenges those kind of misconceptions. And I think it's really important that we as English teachers use those carefully, without overdoing it, without turning everything into history lessons. So yeah, it's got to be valuable in a way that it enhances our understanding, but we don't overdo it. Do we have any other questions at this stage? There's been some absolutely brilliant questions. I'll just give you another 30 seconds just in case. Thanks very much for those of you who are saying nice comments. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. If we don't have any further questions, we shall wrap it up there. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you all, and thank you very, very much for your contributions and for being here today. If there are any other things that crop up, feel free to give me a shout on Twitter, at Mr_English Teach. Very happy to try and discuss these in more detail at any other time. Thank you very much, and we shall leave it there. Thank you.